Hello everybody and welcome back to A-Level History. In this lesson we're going to be talking about James I's relationships with his various parliaments throughout his reign. Now, as you can probably imagine, the relationship with Parliament and the monarchy is something that was very important during this period. And as we continue our study of the Stuart period, when we talk about the English Revolution, the English Civil War, and the ultimate execution of Charles I, spoiler alert, it's important that we talk about Parliament because this is really where a lot of the breakdown in relations took place. So, the reigns of both Charles and James the first can be described as a variety of tensions between the king and parliament. We've already talked about a number of these tensions when we looked at financial problems and also religious issues during this period, but we're going to be focusing specifically on the various parliaments under James in this lesson, and then we'll eventually get on to Charles in a few lessons' time. So the first parliament that James called in his reign was in March 1604. Now don't forget, James took the throne in 1603, so it was actually quite early on in his reign that he decided to to take the step to call parliament and to basically convene parliament. And since James had now inherited the thrones of England, he sought to further unite England and Scotland. Don't forget, James was the monarch of Scotland before he inherited the throne of England. The first thing we could talk about is the union proposals that were drafted when it came to the closer ties and the closer relationship between England and Scotland. And these were drafted by Robert Cecil, who but was met with a lot of opposition with Parliament. This will be a very common theme as we go out through this lesson. The second session of Parliament was held in November 1605, but during this session the main issue that was focused upon was the 1605 Gunpowder plot, which we don't forget was a Catholic conspiracy. And so there was a lot more unity among members of Parliament when it came to legislation that imposed restrictions and attacked Catholics in England as a result of this Gunpowder plot. However, during this session of Parliament from November in 1605, they had also granted £400,000 worth of subsidies to James. So we can see that this second session of Parliament, which ended up ending in May 1606, was actually a little bit more productive than the subsequent parliaments that we're going to see and the parliaments that existed under the reign of Charles I. So we can see that they granted James money, which is effectively what these monarchs called Parliament to do for the most part. And they were very united on the issue of legislation against Catholics as a result of the Gunpowder plot. So the second session of Parliament ended in May 1606, and they didn't meet again until February 1610. So there's actually a long period of time, so effectively 4 years, since Parliament actually met again. And this brings us to skipping a little bit further ahead when we're talking about Parliament. Let's talk about the Addled Parliament of 1614. Okay, this is the Parliament that became known as the Addled Parliament, and the main issue during this was the issue of impositions. So MPs, members of Parliament in the House of Commons, informed the Lords that they sought a conference aiming at petitioning a king against further impositions. So they wanted to effectively get the king to stop any further impositions that they were planning. And ultimately, the Bishop of Lincoln made clear that the issue of impositions was something that was under the royal powers of the prerogative, the powers of the royal prerogative, and so therefore Parliament had little input in the issue of impositions. And it was ultimately following these tensions of this Addled Parliament where the Commons tried to petition the king against impositions, and the House of Lords and the king in return decided to, or at least argued that the power of impositions was a royal prerogative authority. Ultimately it was dissolved by James because they refused to grant him subsidies. So again, James got quite annoyed about not getting any money, and so therefore he dissolved this parliament. This brings us to the third Parliament, James's third Parliament of 1621. So as you can see, there's quite a big gap in the period of when the Parliament was last called and then when this Parliament was called here in 1621. And the main issue of this Parliament was foreign policy. This is because in 1618 the 30 Years' War had begun and James had decided to take part in it effectively. And it already began with shaky tensions and some shaky relations, since James had been reluctant to call his Parliament for the last 7 years. So he had basically left them alone and kept them away from any kind of public office for 7 years. And only when the issue of foreign policy came into fruition that he came back and called Parliament in 1621. And this Parliament ultimately led to the impeachment of the Lord Chancellor Francis Bacon on charges of corruption. And the main reason for this was that James needed funds to support Frederick V in the 30 Years' War. So again, this is an issue relating to foreign policy. And Parliament agreed to grant James these funds, to grant James this support for Frederick V, in return for James's consent to impeach the Lord Chancellor Francis Bacon. So there's a little bit of a quid pro quo going on over here, and further tensions began again when James announced his intention to marry off Charles, who ultimately became Charles I, to a Spanish princess. So this will ultimately become Charles I. So this was not the most productive of parliaments that took place. It already began with a lot of tension because James had refused to call Parliament for 7 years, and ultimately Parliament only granted James what he wanted, which was financing the conflict of the 30 Years' War and to support Frederick V. He only got what he wanted in return for something Parliament wanted. And it shows a little bit of the growing powers of Parliament in this during this period. Parliament was slowly growing in its influence and authority. Let's carry on the story of the next Parliament, the Parliament of 1624. So less time was oopsie daisy. So less time had passed since, and this was the last time James called his Parliament. He would die not long after this. And again, this was called in 1624 with the intention of getting more funds, so more finances. And ultimately, even though James only called this Parliament, and as he did with all the other parliaments, for the purpose of getting money for particular reasons, this Parliament was generally positive in terms of the relations between Parliament and the monarch. And Parliament had granted the king multiple subsidies to fund his foreign policy endeavours. And then again, they ended on positive terms between James and Parliament, because this Parliament only ended when James had died a year later in 1625. So we can see that there was the beginnings of tensions as it relates to the monarch and their relationship with Parliament. Now, James's relationship with Parliament on the whole was generally more positive than when we will look at Charles in a few lessons' time. But James's parliaments did have a lot of tensions in them. So we have, for example, the Addled Parliament of 1614 and the Third Parliament of 1624, only being successful for James in return for something that Parliament wanted, which was the impeachment of Lord Chancellor Francis Bacon. However, ultimately it did end relatively successfully, with relative positive relations between the two with the Parliament of 1624, and the fact that Parliament granted James multiple subsidies, and this Parliament would only end when James died in 1625.